the sly fox, soft beds, warm turnip pie, such pleasant memories. Alas, the tavern's no more. Goblinoids plundered her stores and burnt her to the ground. Vodothrop. Hello everyone, it's your local game master Jimmy here. I'm sure we all know the sensation of defeating the archaic little scoundrels that are goblins. But what if I told you there are much more depths and lore to these little menaces than you might have known? I guarantee that there's at least one wicked or wild little detail in here that you haven't heard of goblins yet. Join me as we unearth the forgotten lore of goblins. I want to establish the lore I am covering is for goblins and will predominantly focus on the Forgotten Realms in Faerun, as that is predominantly where I draw a lot of my source material from. Regardless of that, I might make references to other goblins in popular media, so don't be surprised by that. But of course, I will try to stick to my source as best I can. Before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to paint a vivid picture in your minds of these goblins. Generously, their first appearance in D&D, which appears in Gygax and Arnesen's white box version of Dungeons & Dragons, which we cover in most of these videos when the monster appears, which, like most monsters' descriptions, focuses less on the description of the creature from a thematic case and more of a mechanical state in reference to the corresponding game Chainmail. For this reason, we will get our first clear and concise description of goblins from the Red Dungeon Master's book of Dungeons & Dragons. Their description reads, "Goblins are a human-like race, small and very ugly. Their skin is pale, earthy color, such as chalky tan or livid gray. Their eyes are red and glow when there is little light. Goblins live underground and have well-developed infravision." And if that doesn't feel like we're just scratching the surface of goblins, you'd be correct. There's a lot more to do with these little bastards. I think a pattern we'll see a lot with these earlier descriptions is that they vary in colors slightly from later editions. Even so, by the time we get to the first Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, their color will actually change to pale yellow, orange, and brick red. Luckily, we don't play D&D because we lack imagination, so let's flesh out these little cave menaces properly. Goblins in the Forgotten Realms are a neutral evil short creature with the small size category and are considered a humanoid goblinoid creature type, standing at about 3'4" to 3'8", or just tall enough to stand over a toddler. They weighed anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, which is roughly the weight of about 3 raccoons stacked on top of each other. They are described as having flat faces with broad noses, sharp teeth, and pointed ears. Goblins came in a variety of colors ranging from yellow, orange, red, and even green. It was very common for goblins of the same tribe to share the same tint of their skin tone. A distinguishing feature of all of these goblins are arms that extend down to their knees. Goblins weren't known for being the most hygienic. While they did keep themselves covered with leathers for protection against martial jocks or adventuring parties, their clothing was often soiled when they had to face such adversities toe-to-toe. The lack of hygiene becomes abundantly clear when you visualize how goblins are often portrayed in media like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or even something like Labyrinth. Goblins were known to keep their reliance largely on themselves, which often meant they were not the most brave of soldiers on a battlefield, hence the soiled pants and overall lack of hygiene. Goblins were known to rely primarily on themselves, which often made them unreliable and cowardly soldiers on the battlefield. From a young age, goblins are taught that survival means being aggressive and ruthless toward everyone, including fellow goblins. They're raised to believe that looking out for their own well-being is more important than cooperation or kindness. This mindset often leads goblins to preemptively eliminate anything or anyone they perceive as a threat, and yes, by eliminate, I do mean kill. They just straight take them out, if they can. Much like rangers are completely lost when it comes to finding an identity, goblins are most notably one of the most bullied races of the Forgotten Realms. They often served whichever goblin was the strongest or smartest, and if another larger or more powerful creature would declare itself as a leader of the goblins by overthrowing the smartest or strongest goblin, most goblins would simply accept the new leadership with little pushback. This mindset is directly tied to how goblins often think as individuals and not as a collective. Don't get me wrong. Goblins are more than capable of working as a team, especially when facing common foes. But more often than not, when presented with the amygdala's 2 natural choices, goblins choose flight. Mostly because they do hold a natural sense of self-preservation, they're constantly on the lookout for number 1, which is in all cases themselves. Despite the tarnished morale they hold, goblins aren't necessarily one to be treated lightly.
They often have a wicked temper that often leads to feigning away from much altruistic decision-making. Even amongst their own, goblins don't take slights well. They have been known to be rather sadistic, taking pleasure and precise care in exacting revenge on those they think might have wronged them. In rare occasions, goblins can somewhat combat their natural short tempers and greed tendencies, seeing grander vision, either educating themselves to be leaders of their kin or even steeping from the sides of evil to even become heroes. All cases of this are notably far and few. One such tale is of Noheim, who had escaped slavery to humans in the Silver Marches, but was actually mistakenly captured and returned to his evil home by Dritz Duorden, which is the dark elf that you will very commonly know travels around the realms and sometimes help people for the best and sometimes might not. He does his best. When we talk about goblin society, it is important to understand that the goblins themselves were rather maladaptive, such that they were good to adjusting to new leadership roles, but the way they lived their lives really didn't change from the existing caste structure they got dealt into. So goblin society was called a tribe. These tribes were typically autocratic, being led by the strongest or smartest goblin of the tribe. Of course, they would listen to pretty much whomever they accepted and considered to be their leader, but that was assuming the goblins individually felt like they could trust the new leader within their role. If they didn't, it would likely be that the goblins would conspire to kill the leader and replace them. Since their tribes demanded the strongest or smartest to lead it, it wasn't uncommon for goblins to follow under the leadership of other creatures within the goblinoid family, like hobgoblins or bugbears. While goblins favored the leisures of taking what they wanted over working for it, they were rather skilled miners. Not on the level of kobolds, but they both shared a disdain for direct sunlight, preferring to live underground, and goblins, in a similar theme to kobolds, would mine out large chambers for communal living, leaving only private quarters for individuals of leadership roles, really. These large communal areas would subsequently be some of the most vile, stench-ridden dwellings, while often being fashioned to be laid out for ease of defense and safeguarded with traps. The further into a goblin cave you would venture is likely the more protected the lair would be, and not just because you'd pass out from the stench. Now, it was commonplace in a goblin den to find a surplus of women and children. Like rabbits or kobolds, goblins really leaned into the concept of producing offspring as fast as possible, likely due to the necessity to replace the losses that they often faced from combat and infighting. Natural selection was not really their friend, but they learned quick. It was very common to see goblin society be male-dominated, with the male goblins setting tribes close enough to nearly populated cities that they could raid them and pillage for sustainability. It was the female goblins that often were given the expectation to birth as many children as possible to help maintain the constantly shifting population. While I mentioned goblins occasionally would leave their lives in a tribe to live amongst other civilizations, it was mostly the female goblins driven away from the structured roles they were expected to play. While goblin tribes were not unfamiliar to concepts like farming, they were vastly known for their drive to pillage and pilfer surrounding areas, as I mentioned, for acquiring what they needed. They were prone to overhunt the grounds they lived on, which led to rapid decline in the fauna of the lands they settled near. Now, if all that doesn't make goblins seem appealing enough, wait until you hear this. As they grew accustomed to the lands that they settled in, they would often attack travelers on the road, stripping them of possessions and even taking slaves that they would force to perform hard labor. And we're talking lower labors than they were giving their lowest class of goblins. Now, they were not the sharpest monster and would often get themselves and their allies killed by attracting too much attention to their wrongdoings. For these reasons, goblins would become pretty reliant on following the orders of their tribe leader, even more so if they actually respected them. And while goblins don't have their very own language, they do share a language with the other goblinoid creatures called Gukliak, which was written with a script called Dethic, that is essentially the Dwarven script. However, the goblinoid creatures shifted their script to Thoras script by the late 15th century. I would speculate this was likely because the symbology was easier for the goblins to process, and oftentimes goblins couldn't read anyways, so it was likely done to make it as easy as possible for goblins to read, though it wasn't uncommon to see smarter goblins that could read Orcish or even Yip-Yak, and oftentimes goblins would need the capability to communicate with others they worked with, or those that they planned to betray, which might be kobolds or orcs in this case. So I do want to talk a little bit about goblins' relationship with other monsters real quick. So goblins were suspicious of most other goblinoid races, like hobgoblins and bugbears. In fact, they were taught actually to be more suspicious of other creatures in general. And most other goblinoid races publicly viewed the goblins as annoying, and so goblins would often hold grudges and resentment towards their kin. One might think that they would have developed like a herd mentality to trust one another more, but in reality, they ended up trusting each other less than they trusted other races either, which really hasn't done them a whole lot of favors. Now, on occasion, goblins were known to get along with orcs and half-orcs, mostly due to the world's similar perception of these two monsters, but the only true ally to a goblin, or that a goblin would acknowledge, was a warg. I think I should make a clarification for those that only know wargs from Tolkien's Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Goblins and orcs are synonymous terms in his works, so when you learn about orcs having warg riders in that series, just know that their version of orc and goblin are kind of the same thing. I just wanted to include that note so people understand the relationship between the two in the Forgotten Realms actually is derived from Tolkien's lore. Now, I had to do a little digging into wargs, and they're actually a rather intelligent creature as well, although I found some discrepancies in whether wargs were actually great allies to goblins actually, or if they were more just forced into servitude by goblins. I think this will mean I need to do a dive into wargs at some point to get some further clarity in the future, so I'll hopefully build on this at some point. For the sake of today's video, we will simply assume the goblin's perspective that these creatures were friends and companions that were used for hunting and mounts, or even as pets, even if the warg didn't necessarily feel that way. When it came to their combat prowess, goblins were known for being particularly nimble creatures. They were a decent shot with a short bow and rather adept at slipping in and out of combat. They would utilize this stealthy nature to sneak up on unaware individuals and strike preemptively, ideally eliminating their foes before they had the chance to respond. And as a quick note, even in, I think, the 3rd edition, they mention goblins as being more prone to being rogues in general, which kind of fits for this nature. In most cases, though, when you put them in a toe-to-toe fight, they would likely get squashed by an adventurer, which is why they would usually use this stealth and numbers to get their advantage. So up until now, we have really taken an outside look into goblin society and how they are interacting as a whole. I want to try to focus on the inner works of the tribe. A rather structured aspect of the goblin tribe was its caste system. This system focused largely on ranking goblins on their size, capability, and overall usefulness to a tribe. There were 4 tiers of a goblin caste that made up the tribe as a whole. This system wasn't a unanimous system to all tribes, but for a lot of tribes, this seemed to be a similar framework. In the system, the 4 castes were Lasher, Hunter, Gatherer, and Pariah. The Lashers were the equivalent of nobility and high-class goblins within the tribe. The name Lasher is derived from their preferred weapon of choice, a whip. These were goblins that had useful skills to the tribe, or were often smarter than the rest of the goblins of the clan. A particularly notable member of the Lasher caste, other than the tribe's leader, were the Booyogs. Booyog is the goblin word equivalent for magic. And these were goblins that could wield magic, simply. A small note before going into the Booyogs, this caste system, along with the different Booyogs, gained a lot more prevalence and overall lore by 5th edition D&D. So you might find one of the 5 different types of Booyogs within a tribe, occasionally multiple, but this was somewhat region-based. Each Booyog drew their magic in different ways. The first of which were Booyog casters, which were more often trained wizard goblins that were taught under some form of probably hobgoblin or higher intelligence goblinoid. They were oftentimes rather smart goblins and had great potential to be advisors or leaders of tribes. The next magical goblin was the Booyog Wielder. These were goblins that may not have been actual spellcasters, but had come across a magic item that they had learned how to use the activation word, making them a capable threat. It might be important to include that these might not have been the brightest of the goblins that were Booyogs and could often prove to be unpredictable, especially if they didn't fully understand what their magic item did, which kind of makes them pretty funny. Our third magical goblin is the Booyog Whip. These goblins had the ability to dominate other lesser intelligent goblins. Essentially, this goblin had capable psionic powers, which is like brain powers in D&D, and it would essentially use this ability, psionic ability, to dominate other goblins into serving them. kind of similar how a mind flayer dominates individuals to working for them. The fourth magical goblin was the Booyog Slave, which was essentially a warlock goblin that had made some form of promise in flesh or blood to a greater being that granted the goblin magic powers. This is the equivalent of a warlock making a pact for their magic, which oftentimes these goblins were dealing with fiends or hags that granted their powers. So generally not the best sort anyways. And lastly, you had the Booyog Booyog Booyog, which is probably one of my favorite versions of a goblin. This goblin was tied to sorcery through wild magic, like the Bloodline in the 5th edition if you're familiar with it. So this goblin was extremely volatile and was seen as one of the most dangerous goblins you could come across, because anytime they cast any form of spell, using a spell slot or a cantrip, it would cause rather volatile, potent wild magic to trigger, and you never knew what was going to happen. And that's from cantrips too, which is very uncommon. And again, while Booyogs were a rather potent creature within the Lasher tier, they were somewhat few and far between. Our next tier in the caste system are the Hunters. And to clarify, this caste is going in descending order, so the further along we go, it's the lower in status amongst the caste you're getting. The Hunters are goblins that were often well-versed in the lay of the land around their home and tribe. So these hunters are often actual hunters or animal tamers for the tribe. While not actually necessarily the smartest of the goblins, they made for great foot soldiers and scouts amongst the tribe. The next tier of this caste system are the Gatherers. They often make up the majority of the goblins who show a great deal of cowardice in the face of opposition. These goblins are responsible for crafting poisons, checking all the traps set by the hunters, and scavenging food from the natural environment. They often don't carry weapons and would shy away if people come across them. They probably wouldn't attack you on spot if you were an adventurer. The Gatherers often believe Lashers and Hunters to have some form of greater intelligence that they could even understand, and they used this greater understanding to survive outside of the caves, which they didn't like to travel outside of. They often fell into this more submissive role in the society. Now, our last tier of the caste system is the Pariah. Oftentimes the weakest and least bright of the goblins, pariahs often get handed the worst jobs like mucking animal pens, cleaning goblin caves, and even hard labor such as mining. Although one little niche that the pariahs get above all the other goblins is they're actually tasked with dominating the slaves taken in by the tribe, and slaves on the other hand were viewed by goblins as not even having a place in their caste system at all, so pretty bad. Since goblins focus their merits on themselves often, it shouldn't be unsurprising to know that they oftentimes will also try to vie for higher tier in the caste system. This can be done by proving oneself of belonging in a higher caste by taking out a higher tier goblin, or going as finite as infighting within the same caste for better privileges, but you gotta take that with a grain of salt too. Amongst everything, the biggest infighting amongst the goblin caste system lies within the Lasher level. Goblins model their system of rule after the goblinoid pantheon they come from, which teaches goblins to have a singular autocratic ruler. While a goblin tribe ruler often holds the absolute power, this definitive rule kind of crumbles upon their ideas of naming a successor or an heir, and oftentimes goblin tribes will just completely fall into disarray and infighting and arguing for the next ruler just when their ruler dies or when they need to name a new one for any reason. And I haven't really gotten into the aspect of goblins using theological practice as a justification to their leadership and rule style. It is somewhat important to understand what sort of gods they worship to get an understanding of why they are the way they are. While most goblins didn't necessarily go around preaching the word of their god to others, they did revere and respect the goblin gods. To a goblin, Maglubiet is the most familiar name, inspiring goblins with their excellent strength and treachery. Maglubiet ruled the other goblin gods like a goblin boss ruling their underlings with an iron fist. Maglubiet was a chief deity of all other goblinoid creatures and was best known for killing off any gods that wouldn't fall under his subjugation. To paint a picture of how aggressive and murder-prone this god was, in recorded history of Faerun, there are only a handful of remaining other gods in any of the goblinoid pantheons. In an almost forgotten time period, the Goblin Wars took place, where the gods slew most of the others. From among those not slain, Kurgerbayag, the Overseer, is the only other remaining goblin god. There are a few individual gods of other goblinoid races that still exist, like Nomag Gaia, or Bargraviek, who are situated around the hobgoblins, but many of the goblinoid gods that did exist are now forgotten husks in the Astral Sea. And I want to take a moment to talk about Kurgobayag, which I'll call Kuro for now, which will make sense when I mention it later. Kuro, the Overseer, essentially Kuro exemplified all the ideals of why goblins sought to take slaves, having order and power over others than themselves. It was very common to pariahs to focus their theological learning on Kuro to hopefully understand the ways in which the god tormented and dominated others. If it's not clear, goblins have a lot of negative influences on them, further fueling their greedy and evil tendencies. Unlike other gods that granted many blessings, Kuro would often instill teachings to goblins, such as the dog-eat-dog mentality in which only in wielding the whip could its lash truly be escaped. Goblins held these teachings rather precious, going as far as safeguarding crafting techniques of objects of torment like leather whips to certain families within tribes. Many of the servants of the Overseer would serve mostly as advisors to goblin tribes that would often choose to capture and enslave foes. While servants of the Overseer did occasionally gain some benefits and boons, they largely focused on the subjugation of others. And just to take a moment to mention Maglubiet, this was the god of domination and subjugation as well, seeing as he took out all of the other gods. He was a predominant worshipped god amongst all goblins because he was kind of one of the only options, seeing as Kuro essentially bent the knee to Maglubiet, basically, and all the goblins tend to fall in line, and this can even proceed into bugbears and hobgoblins, but we could go over them at a later time. Now, leaving the theological practices of most goblins, I want to shift the focus to different types of goblins that would be considered subspecies of goblins across Toril, the greater world of the Forgotten Realms. I don't want to go into crazy detail on some of these, as they somewhat leave the conceptual idea of a goblin that we've talked about and tend to lean towards very unique subspecies that could be entirely different creatures. So our first goblin variant is the Bakemono. They are native to Karatur, which is essentially the eastern realm of Faerun. The Bakemono are based on the Japanese Bakemono, which means to change, and these were basically goblins that had weird mutations about them. They didn't really act like normal goblins either, and were often full cannibals, and weirdly enough, they occasionally had wings. They're a whole thing entirely. Barely a goblin, but technically a goblin. Our next subspecies is the Batiri, which are goblins that are native to the jungles of Cholt, which, depending on the time period you're exploring the Forgotten Realms, is an island in the Forgotten Realms history or not an island. The Batiri were much more bloodthirsty than normal goblins, predominantly green goblinoid species that worshipped a Batiri queen in Cholt. Now, they all revered patron deities that looked essentially like crazy, scary dinosaur creatures in Cholt, but on a separate side note for the Batiri, they weren't exclusive to this form of worship. It was largely tribe-based in Cholt, and one of which these tribes worshipped Kurgobayag, whom they referred to as Kuro, who is obviously that spared god we talked about. Now, the Batiri are the ones that referred to Kuro as Kuro and not Kurgobayag, and it just makes it easier for me to say it just using Kuro, and that Batiri tribe was actually called the Kuro tribe. So our next goblin is the Decanter goblins, which were a subspecies of goblin that had rhino-like horns and bushy black manes. They were artificially created in one of Faerun's northwest mines called the Decanter Mines, hence where their name comes from. They were more stocky and more aggressive than normal goblins. They were actually the result of experiments performed on normal goblins by Alhun the Beast Lord, which was the local name for a variant undead form of an Illithid. The Decanter goblins followed Alhun devoutly, but still made room for their god Maglubiet. Now, Grod goblins are a more sophisticated version of the goblin that actually served a dragon named Nalavara. They had lime green skin with light blue eyes and often were more androgynous overall than any other subspecies of goblin. They're actually a rather interesting subspecies of goblin that I'm considering doing a video over. There's just so much about them that's really cool. So I'll hopefully save that one for another time. The last variant I want to cover is the Nilbog, which for clarity is just goblin backwards. And by all means, these are the goofiest of all goblin kin. A Nilbog was a normal goblin possessed by some form of mysterious trickster spirit in a condition called Nilbogism. Essentially, most normal actions that would take place against this goblin worked in the opposite manner as intended. So hurting the Nilbog could heal it, while aggression towards it may result in the aggressor praising and giving it all of their belongings and possessions. It was more common to see Nilbogs in places where goblins were actually heavily mistreated, and most normal goblins often viewed Nilbogs as creatures possessed by fragments of one of the unnamed trickster deities slaughtered by Maglubiet. For this reason, goblins would often give the Nilbog a title of Jester, which bypassed any other role within their caste system, letting them do whatever they wanted. Now, before we call this video to an end, we haven't really talked about the origins of goblins as to where they derive from originally in the Forgotten Realms. In this world, it is believed that their native realm, prior to the subjugation and conquering by Maglubiet, was among the court of the Queen of Air and Darkness within the Feywild. It is believed that this is where they got their knack for being dexterous and nimble. While this is the believed origin, the goblins don't necessarily understand this to be their origin, nor do many care when comparing any to Maglubiet. As I have made probably very clear, Maglubiet pretty much got all goblins to fall in line and obey. And I hadn't really gone over how this really compares with hobgoblins and bugbears, but I figured I could save that for when we go over them potentially. I really brought this up towards the closing because goblins were recently changed from their humanoid goblin creature types to Fey in the most recent version of Dungeons & Dragons. And before we go over to an end with this, I want to quickly go over the 2024 version of the Goblin and look at the art and then just talk about their description. So let's go over it real quick. So goblins in 2024 are referred to as wild tricksters and troublemakers. The book describes them. Actually, they give 3 paragraphs over them, which I really like. I think the art that they use has these green goblins that look like they're about to do an ambush, and I think that really kind of fleshes them out as to being ambush predator creatures that will go raid something. Now, a little funny note before I go into this description is they include a small little note at the bottom that says Briark, which is an approximate translation from Goblin to Common, which stands for Hey Ruby. This is a direct reference to the Keep on the Borderlands, which was one of Gygax's first published modules for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And that's just a fun note on the side because it is the first module I ever played in. So very fun one. Do recommend it. It's crazy. I think they're going to be doing a revision of this adventure for this edition. So be on the lookout for that. I think that could be a lot of fun. So they provide 4 actual different variations of goblins. You have the Goblin Minion, Goblin Warrior, Goblin Boss, and Goblin Hexer. So the description reads as follows. Goblins are Feywild embodiments of recklessness and ruin. They delight in wreckage. The louder, the more energetic, and the more convoluted, the better. Goblin raids are often as much opportunities to enjoy setting fires and tormenting livestock as they are parts of a more disruptive plot. Goblins obey those who accomplish the wildest plans. Such leaders might be goblin raid masterminds, bombastic magic users, or those capable of making the loudest noise. Hobgoblins and forceful humanoids might also command ornery groups of goblins, directing their destructiveness towards banditry, sabotage, or war. The deity Maglubiet claims to be the god of goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears, and on the infinite battlefields of Acheron, the deity commands innumerable goblin legions. In ages long past, Maglubiet witnessed the destructive propensity of goblins and relocated a population of them from the Feywild to his realm on the Outer Plains. Since then, hordes of these more martial-minded goblins have flourished, with some finding their way to the material worlds. These vicious invaders seek to sow ruin in preparation for their god's conquest. I think it's kind of an interesting description for the goblins because it definitely tries to paint them in the light of the Feywild, which is what this edition was trying to do. I think it's fine for them to draw the history back to the Feywild for the goblins, which kind of plays into that, how they're very tricksy. And I think that's okay given the nature of the Feywild if you're familiar with it being a rather tricksy place. And it kind of ties the goblins into that well, especially because their history was rather, it didn't talk about their origins much at all, as we didn't really mention where they really came from. Now, we didn't necessarily go over that with every single creature, but goblins specifically, I think their origin as being just pests that are around gets fleshed out a little bit by saying they're from the Feywild, especially when we draw their roots to being from one of the Fey courts. Now, the fact that they don't give a shit about the actual Fey courts and just enjoy the idea of working for Maglubiet, I think is more on par for how goblins actually are. And I don't think you guys need me to tell you to include goblins within your next D&D campaign. They probably are already there, especially because they're one of the most abundant species in the Forgotten Realms. and can also serve as really great smaller foes or overwhelming hordes. And it's good to know that there is this enemy out there that doesn't have a lot of very redeeming qualities, that just helps you introduce murder as a very viable option for some of these monsters within gameplay. So that's all for today, and next time I'll hopefully go over whatever species we plan to cover next, whatever monster we cover from D&D. So until next time, I'm the local game master. Thank you guys.